The 1920s was a decade between World War I and the Great Depression. It was a time that gave America the chance to change and reshape itself artistically, culturally, and morally. It was a time where American traditions and taboos were debated and rebelled against by younger generations. It was old America versus new America. Younger generations defied traditional sexual attitudes, styles, and gender roles. Jazz music, entertainment, dancing, and drinking completely flourished at this time. This incredible cultural evolution did not come easy. African Americans in the South desperately wanted to escape segregation and the brutality of the Ku Klux Klan. It was the terror of the KKK that drove hundreds of thousands of African Americans to join a great migration and move north to cities like Chicago, New York, and Boston. When African Americans were finally given freedom to be expressive, it created a cultural and artistic explosion known as the Harlem Renaissance. The Roaring Twenties pitted old America against new America, and nowhere was this more intense than in the KKK, the Great Migration, and the Harlem Renaissance.
A white supremacist group known as the Ku Klux Klan was the epitome of old America. In the 1920s, the KKK used horrific acts of violence to terrorize their targets, which include Roman Catholics, Jews, African Americans, foreigners, bootleggers, and divorcees. After World War I, about 3 million members in the KKK were accounted for. They had the most influence in the South. They paraded the streets hooded and robed in their white uniforms. Their goal was to intimidate and drive pure fear into African Americans. The parades and marches were only the start. Lynchings, tarring and feathering, kidnapping, rapes, and murders were all barbaric acts of violence performed by the KKK against their targets. In 1924, the KKK was at its peak and had the most power and influence that they had ever had.
They controlled 24 of the nation's 48 legislatures. They had an unbelievable amount of influence when it came to elections and nominations. For many Americans, the thought that other citizens supported the KKK was utterly revolting, and their brutal, inhumane ways of intimidation were accepted by so many. The fear that they caused fueled their power.
The fear that deteriorated the African Americans' will to live a life worth living drove them to move north in a progressive movement known as the Great Migration.
The Great Migration was a massive movement of people, mainly African Americans, throughout all of the 1920s. During this time, there were various conflicts between black and white people. Racial tensions were not the only thing that drove hundreds of thousands of African Americans north. They wanted to escape tenant farming, sharecropping, and peonage.
African Americans knew moving north would allow them to build better lives for themselves. They moved from southern states like Minnesota, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina to northern states like Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and New York. The fear of the KKK, racism, segregation, poor working conditions, and not having the freedom to express themselves was enough motivation for them to finally get out of the cell. In turn, the most significant literary and artistic movement in African American history occurred.
The Harlem Renaissance was an era that finally allowed African Americans to be expressive and creative. It showed what these people could create once they were given the freedom to express themselves. Like the outbreak of jazz and blues music completely changed the entertainment at this time.
Every time I close my eyes, blowing that trumpet of mine, I look right into the heart of good old New Orleans, and it has given me something to live for. Louis Armstrong.
But for the national welfare, it is urgent to realize that the minorities do think, and think about something other than the race problem. Zora Neale Hurston.
Writing and poetry fed into the growth of racial pride. African Americans could finally have their voices heard.
The Roaring Twenties pitted old America against new America, and nowhere was this more intense than in the KKK, the Great Migration, and the Harlem Renaissance. Old America was represented as the KKK terrorized the South. Fear-stricken African Americans joined the Great Migration and moved north. They found their place in the city of Harlem, where they changed African American history with their art and literature. The Harlem Renaissance was the image of new America and showed what amazing things could be created once traditions were broken.